Welcome to this video where I'm going to show you how to make this dynamic scarf hair tie. You can download this pattern for free by following the link in the description box below, where if you sign up to the Self-Made Surroundings newsletter, I will send you a copy directly to your inbox so that you too can make one for yourself. First, let's go over the tools and materials that you're going to need for this project. You will need fabric scissors, some snips or other small sharp scissors, a hand sewing needle, a safety pin or bodkin, some pins, a basic sewing machine, and lastly an iron and ironing board. For this tutorial, I'm going to make the scarf hair tie in this leftover piece of beautiful silk organza that I had from a previous project. I really like the way that the colour deepens when the folds of fabric lay over one another. I also think that the transparency will highlight the form of the scarf when the pin hemline is constructed around its edges. But this design will really work with any light to medium weight woven fabric that you might have. Here are some other examples of the design where I've constructed the hair tie in a lightweight fabric with a much softer drape. Before selecting your fabric, don't forget to refer to the notes on fabric selection in the pattern instructions, where I detail some other things that you may want to consider. You will also need some general purpose thread to match your chosen fabric, a thick hair tie, or, alternatively, a small length of thinner elastic to form a hair tie. If you've chosen to use an existing hair tie, you can skip ahead to step 2, which is time-stamped in this video. I'm going to use a piece of elastic to form the hair tie so that I can show you that part of the construction process. So if you are following along with me, let's move on to step 1. To form the hair tie, you need to bring one end of the elastic over to meet the other to fold the length in half. Next, align the edges and join with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. I don't normally use pins to hold the elastic in place, but if you feel more comfortable doing so, please feel free to. To make the join in the elastic strong, it's important to reinforce the seam. You do this by stitching forward to the end of the elastic and reversing backwards over your stitching line. You need to repeat this a few times to make the join nice and strong. A great tip for producing a professional looking project is to get into the habit of clipping your threads as you're working. By doing this, you eliminate the possibility of catching longer tail threads in other lines of stitching, which can look messy and be hard to rectify at the end. So now that we've joined the ends of the elastic, you need to trim back one of the seam allowances to 5 millimeters. We're going to do this to reduce the bulk of the seam. It really doesn't matter which one you trim back. However, if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to trim back the front one. You then need to fold the longer seam allowance over to cover the one that's been trimmed back. We are then going to stitch this in place through the main loop of the elastic and the longer remaining seam allowance. Again, you will need to reinforce this join like you did previously. And don't forget to clip your threads. When you've finished, it should look something like this. You can place the hair tie aside so that we can move on with the rest of the construction. In step 2, we're going to construct the faux knot. Working with the smaller rectangular piece that you cut on the bias, you need to align the longer edges of this shape. Fold the right sides of your fabric to face each other. By folding the rectangle in half, we're going to form a tube. I'm choosing to pin the seam allowances together on this panel in a few strategic points. As often, when a piece is cut on the bias, it can be difficult to align the seam allowances accurately as you're sewing, even on a really straight piece such as this. I'm going to use about 4 pins along this length. However, you can use as many as you feel comfortable with. So once you've finished, you need to construct the seam along the length of your rectangle with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. At the start and end of your seam, you will need to reinforce to stop the seam from unravelling. Reinforcement on a seam is done by stitching forward about 3 to 4 stitches, then reversing back over those stitches before you continue sewing forward, constructing the length of your seam. A great tip to take care of your sewing machine is to try to remember to take your pins out as you are sewing, regardless of the direction or angle that they're placed at. And this is because sewing over your pins can blunt the feed dogs underneath, and there's also a possibility of breaking a needle, which you should try to avoid if you can. Next, we're going to turn through the tube to enclose the seam allowances using our safety pin. Attach the safety pin to one end of the tube through the seam allowances. You then need to feed the safety pin through the tube, scrunching the fabric over the safety pin. Once you can't scrunch anymore, hold on to the safety pin with one hand and pull the excess or scrunched fabric away over the tube. Keep repeating this process until the safety pin comes out the other end of the tube. Remove the safety pin from the seam allowance. Moving to the ironing board now, you need to press the tube flat. Try to center the seam in the middle of the tube so that you are pressing in 2 folds on either side of the seam or on either side of the tube. Put the faux knot aside and let's move on to step 3. In this step, we're going to construct the scarf. Around all the edges of the scarf, we're going to use a method of hemming called a pin hemline. Essentially, this type of hem is a very narrow double-rolled hem. To begin, we're going to sew a line of stay stitching 1 centimetre from the edge on all 4 sides of the scarf. There is no need to do any reinforcement at the start or end of this stitching line as it's not joining anything together. Rather, it acts as a guideline to indicate where to form the first fold of the hemline. Additionally, it also helps the fabric not to stretch out too much when pressing under this fold line. When you get to the corner, you need to finish with your needle in your work. If your needle finishes up, simply wind it in, lift your presser foot, pivot round the corner, then place your presser foot down again and continue sewing. You need to repeat this process for all remaining sides and corners. Moving to the ironing board now, beginning with one side of your scarf, you need to press under the hem allowance 2 millimeters past the stay stitching line towards the wrong side of your fabric. The stitching line should not be visible from the right side of your fabric, so there should be a pressed in fold line 2 millimeters above your line of stay stitching. It's important to try to be as accurate as you can in folding a uniform width along the length of the hemline, as it will greatly affect the final look of your overall hem. A tip to improve your accuracy is to do a finger press first before using the iron to form a more permanent line. A finger press creates a light fold in the fabric, much like you would do if you were creasing a piece of paper. It can allow you a little bit more control over how much you are folding without having to worry about burning your fingers with the steam of the iron. Most natural and regenerated cellulosic fibres tend to lend themselves to a finger press, however synthetics tend not to, so you would need to test how your fabric performs with a finger press and make a judgment as to whether this tip might help you. Once you've finished pressing under the hem allowance on the first side, repeat this process on the opposite side. Using your fabric scissors, you now need to very carefully trim back the hem allowance to 2 millimeters away from the stay stitching line. Again, with this step, it's important to try to be as accurate as possible, as the cut edge acts as a guide in width when turning the hemline over whilst you're sewing. So we are aiming for a uniform distance away from the stay stitching line. A great tip to achieve this level of accuracy is to slow down your cutting. Remember that making beautiful things takes time, so try to enjoy the parts that are slow as well as the parts of the construction that are faster. It's also important to note that I've sped up the footage here in the editing process, so don't use my cutting speed as a guide for you. Once you've finished trimming the first side, you'll need to repeat that process on the opposite side. Once you've completed the trimming on both sides, you need to press under the hem allowance on the 2 remaining sides. Remember to fold the hem allowance towards the wrong side of the fabric, folding 2 millimeters past your stay stitching line. And really try to be as accurate as you can when folding and aligning the right angles at the corners. Now that you've completed the pressing on the remaining sides, you need to repeat the trimming process to remove the excess hem allowance. Remember, you want to trim this allowance to 2 millimeters past the stay stitching line, so slow down to try to be as accurate as you can in cutting a uniform width along the length. So once you have completed all of the trimming, it should look something like this. Next, we're going to press in the final fold line of the hem just at the corners. If you orientate your corner at a right angle to yourself, like I'm doing, you first want to press in the vertical side for about 5 centimeters in length. Then press in the remaining horizontal side again for about 5 centimeters in length. We are doing this to help us keep the corners as neat and accurate as possible in the next part of the construction process. Moving to the next corner now, working in a clockwise direction, you need to repeat this folding pattern, as in pressing in the vertical side first, followed by the horizontal. Complete this process for all remaining corners. Once you have completed all the pressing of the corners, it's time to move back to your sewing machine. A great tip to improve the accuracy of the final top stitch of your hemline is to use an edge stitching foot like I have here. You can complete the hemline without this type of presser foot, however, it just helps to improve the accuracy and speed in which you can sew on such a narrow hemline. To begin, I'm going to twist my needle into my work using the manual stitch winder on the side of my machine. This is really going to help me to begin the stitching in the correct place in the corner and also to hold the two hem allowances in place accurately. There's no need to do any reinforcement at the start as we're going to stitch all the way round our edges and meet back where we started. As you begin to sew the length of your hemline, you will feel how the inner cut edge naturally guides where to turn your fabric, creating a uniform width along the hemline. So the basic process is to fold and roll the hemline over as you're sewing. A good tip is to work on small sections at a time rather than thinking about the whole length. You can see how I'm sewing a section, then stopping and folding over a new section before beginning to sew again. When you get to the corner, you will need to have your needle in your work before you're lifting your presser foot, pivoting, placing your presser foot down again, and continuing sewing. Sometimes the corners can get a bit stuck on the feed dogs underneath. If you do encounter this problem, the best thing to do is to manually stitch using the winder on the side of your machine. Additionally, you could also try using a pin as a handle by placing it in your work. You then have something to hold on to help move your machine forward away from the apex of the corner. So keep working in this way until you reach the start of your stitching line again. Here you can run your stitching off the edge or alternatively pivot at the starting corner and sew over your stitches for about 3 to 4 stitches before removing your work from the machine. Moving to the ironing board now, we're going to press all the edges of the scarf nice and flat. Once your pressing is complete, we're ready to move on to the next step. In step 4, we're going to form the scarf drape. To begin, orientate your scarf so that it sits like a diamond opposite you. You then want to fold this diamond roughly into thirds. Take one corner and fold it into the center, then take the opposite corner and fold it into the center on top. Now, I have had to orientate my scarf in a different direction to you in order to fit it within the frame of the camera. However, you can understand that the principle is the same, in that I'm bringing two opposite corners in towards the center and overlapping them. Once you're happy with the placement of the corner overlap, you will need to take some pins and secure this position in place. I'm going to place a pin in each corner. Next, rule a line through the center of the length of your scarf, marking this line in with a chalk pencil. Using a hand sewing needle with a double-stranded thread, you're going to sew a large running stitch, stitching through the line that you just marked. Instead of tying a knot at the end of your thread, a good tip is to stitch a few small stitches on the spot, which sort of forms a knot and attaches the thread to the fabric at the same time. I find that starting hand stitching in this way stops the knot from pulling through your fabric. Try to make your running stitches 1 to 1.5 centimeters apart. Continue stitching until you reach the end of the line. Once you've finished stitching, you're going to pull this thread tightly to form a gather or a pinch in the center of the scarf. Next, wrap your thread around the center and stitch through all the pleats and folds that you've just created to secure the drape in place. You will need to repeat this process of wrapping and stitching through the drape towards the back of the scarf. Once this is complete, you're ready to move on to the final step. In step 5, we're going to assemble all the components of the hair tie. First, we're going to join the scarf to the hair tie. Your thread should still be attached to your scarf. You are going to stitch the hair tie to the back of the scarf. It should be positioned in the center or the pinch point of the scarf drape. If you're using a formed elastic hair tie like me, the join in the elastic should be matched to the center of the scarf drape. I'm using an overcast stitch to attach the hair tie to the scarf. I'm forming the stitches close together to make the join strong for a length of about 1/2 centimetre. Once you've completed the first side of stitching, stitch through the drape again to bring your needle over to the other side of the hair tie and repeat the process. Once you've completed the stitching, you want to do a number of stitches on the spot to form a knot. Clip your threads back. You can now see how stitching on both sides of the hair tie has made this join really strong. Next, take your faux knot and feed it through the hair tie with the seam facing down. Flip the whole thing over and tie a knot. Take the two ends and reverse the direction and wrap them round to the back. Then feed the ends through the back of the knot and stitch them in place. There is no exact way to achieve the drape of this knot. Rather, it's something that you need to fiddle with a little bit to create a drape that is visually appealing. We're aiming to create the illusion of the scarf being tied in a knot around the hair. If you've ever tried this classic hairstyle before, you will have found that the scarf produces a bulky knot and it can be difficult to get both the scarf and the ponytail to sit in a way that's comfortable and will also last throughout the day. So this hair tie version reduces the bulk, however, we are still trying to emulate a real looking knot. So you really need to do some experimentation and observation of how your fabric is forming the drape and make adjustments to how tight you're pulling the knot and also how much of the length of the panel you might need. Once you're happy with the look of the drape, you need to stitch the hair tie to the faux knot using an overcast stitch. You can see I'm stitching quite close to the initial join of the hair tie so that the ends of the knot panel will end up being hidden underneath. You need to complete this step on both ends of the panel. Once you've finished the stitching, you simply need to adjust the final knot drape by pulling it out softly. And the final step is to carefully trim back any excess knot panel ends that are sticking out using your fabric scissors. And there you have it. Your scarf hair tie is complete. If you do create this design for yourself, I would love to see the results. So please use the hashtag SMS_scarf hair tie so that I can find your amazing examples and share them with others so that they too might be inspired to make something for themselves. In the meantime, create with care, imagine with intention, make lovingly for longevity, and I'll see you in the next one.